Welcome everyone. I'm Sunil Amrith at the Department of South Asian Studies and History here at Harvard, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the Mahindra Humanities Center. The director, Homi Bhabha, sends his regrets that he can't be with us this evening, but it's my honor and great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Shahid Amin, who needs no introduction to most of you here. Professor Amin is currently visiting research professor at Goa University, having spent 30 years at Delhi University until 2015. Professor Amin is one of the founding members of the Subaltern Studies Collective, and his work has really reshaped the field of modern South Asian history and fields far beyond that. One of the things that's always struck me is that across many of the divides of interpretation and philosophy in the field of South Asian history, Professor Amin's work is universally admired. And I think of some of the early essays in the Subaltern Studies volumes, Gandhi as Mahatma, Approver's Testimony, and see how generations of students, including my own now, just find these irresistibly compelling works that stimulate their historical imagination. This work culminated in his masterpiece, Event, Memory, Metaphor, Chauri Chara, 1922 to 1992, which was a deep study of history and memory in that iconic moment in India's nationalist movement. Since then, Professor Amin has provided a concise encyclopedia of North Indian peasant life, and most recently a book called Conquest and Communities, The Afterlife of Warrior Saint Ghazi Mian. I'm absolutely delighted to have Professor Amin with us this evening, and I'd like you to join me in giving him a warm welcome to Harvard.
Thank you, Sunil, for this very generous introduction, and thank you, all of you, for coming to this talk. I believe things academic are winding up now. I mean, for this semester at Harvard, and for people to come for this talk, I'm really delighted to be here. This is, in fact, I don't know why is it that I sometimes take very long writing whatever I'm trying to do, and so normally more than a decade. But time moves very slowly in eastern part of India, and I try to catch up with that and don't quite succeed. So this is, I mean, I'm delighted to be over here because, in fact, it was way back in 2001 that Sugata Bose invited me to talk to the South Asia Initiative. And I was then trying to write this book that finally appeared in 2015, all because of delays in the publication process, presumably. And it was Homi who was the commentator at that time. So I'm absolutely delighted. And I'm trying, in today's talk, I'll try and use some of the arguments deployed in that book and some of the thinking that has gone into that book and present that as a part of a more general argument. I'm also delighted at the poster because unknown to them, in fact, the talk would end with a little poem on bird's nest. Which is obviously related to the idea of habitation. Now, I've called this Making the Nation Habitable, which itself is provocation enough. Don't we inhabit it already? But as at least in Delhi, if you are a new tenant and it's very hot, then you come in and say, look, we want copper wiring because otherwise the air conditioners won't be able to take the load. So, though you might be inhabiting a place, obviously we all try, and that's what happens when houses change owners, to make it even more habitable. So it's not an invitation for arguing that the habitations don't exist and then inhabitants are going to come. Which is really a description of colonialism of empty spaces in the Pacific. Now, Now, theorists of non-Western nationalisms have been concerned for quite some time now with understanding the great deal of traffic in social, political, and identity concerns that are clearly transnational in nature. Commenters have even referred in a light-hearted vein to exuberant display of long-distance nationalism. In fact, a phrase used much earlier in an article by Benedict Anderson. But long-distance nationalism really, when Ben Anderson talked about it, really dependent on long-distance telephone calls, shall we say, for a much earlier period. But now today, not only is this long-distance nationalism very exuberant, and it's possible for it to be so exuberant because of instant communication rather than trying to get connected through a subscriber trunk dialing code, as was the case in India earlier on. Now, two interrelated factors seem to have contributed to this rise of nationalism of, what shall we say, Indians not normally resident in India. There is a category called NRI, non-resident Indians. So I'll use Indians not normally resident in India. What are these factors? Basically, large-scale white-collar migration, of course. And I say white-collar migration because historically from, in fact, the earlier global flow of Indian migrants has been very interestingly linked to slavery and its abolition in the 1830s. So that in the sugar colonies, it is the end of slavery that really creates a space through the colonial network for Indians, poor Indians, who were then called coolie, to be inducted into the production of sugar capitalism, shall we say. So obviously, the sheer existence of large number of people is not what is new. Flows out of India have taken for a very long time, but there is something qualitatively different happening, and in which case people have identified the large-scale white-collar migration. That is obviously, this phenomena constitutes, shall we say, the physical body. Avenues of instant communication are, shall we say, the collateral arteries through which affects, dispositions, and purposive actions circulate from one part of the world to another, which largely is India. Concomitantly, South Asian states, especially India, seek to attract first-generation emigres largely and their investments for the greater good of the mother country. Transnational organizations tied to particular social and political formations back home now act as extension of the Indian body polity, seeking in turn to affect its shape and course, notably the democratic process, or even its common sense, to use that very well-known phrase of Raymond Williams, the structure of feeling. One could argue that these are transnational effects to make these particular countries better places for the permanent residents of those nations. In a word, make these more habitable for the locals. I leave it to the theorists such as Arjun Appadurai and Partha Chatterjee to debate the finer points of these trends and tendencies. Instead, excuse me, let me begin by flagging some of the developments that form the backdrop to my argument today. Excuse me. In his article, The Smallness Thrust Upon Us, Amartya Sen has a telling phrase. Writes Sen, quoting, "Any kiddie in school can love like a fool," Ogden Nash had proclaimed. "But hating my boy is an art," unquote. Continues Sen, "That art is widely practiced by skilled artists and instigators, and the weapon of choice is identity," unquote. This is a refrain that you'd also come across in some of the later essays of Eric Hobsbawm. Were we to substitute identity with history, or even interlink the two, a fair amount of the view of our past mind you, not our pasts, but our singular past, in the quest for the new Indian will emerge in sharper focus. I'm referring to the increasing stridency in the discourse about nation and nationalism in South Asia, India in particular. This has had the effect of sacrificing the citizens who embody cultural and historical diversity within, in fact, newly constituted nations as the altar of what could be called majoritarian certitude. The way and mores of a largely religiously conceived national community. I exaggerate, of course, but one would not be far off the mark, one suspects, in saying that the very first words after mother that a child may learn to utter in middle-class Delhi homes today might well turn out to be anti-national. Such is the invocation of this negative sign for those falling outside the devotional arc of motherland worship in today's India, outside the devotional arc. In my talk today, I shall try and etch some of the contours of the rise of what I call majoritarian politics, come common sense, come history, especially in India in the last 3 decades or so. I shall begin by going over the implications of this relatively new development and the 3-decade-old shift of a majoritarian worldview almost to the center of public discourse. It needs stressing that the post-colonial idea of India lies in, or was sought to be worked out within the field of plurality and diversity, which is encoded in the Indian Constitution. Enshrine is a word that's better left outside the descriptions of constitution making. It is worth repeating that this was a constitution in India that was debated, agreed upon, and drawn up between 1947 and 49, when in the manner of, shall we say, buy one, get one free, independence came packaged along with partition of the country. So these two independent states, India and Pakistan in 47, to some extent largely based on religious grounds, resulted, as we all know, in mayhem, mass murder, mass migration, and what could be called the prehistory of the enactment of ethnic cleansing. This initial backdrop to my talk would take us to what one could call the Islam question in India's medieval history, its place in the imagination and social and political life of a newly enacted and truncated nation, a nation that was constituted politically in terms of the Constitution as a land of diverse or at a very broad set of homogeneous people with certain very common characteristics, but a great range of diversity. I shall then engage briefly with the trope of syncretism in the religious-social lives of our people during the heyday of medieval sultans and the great Mughals, until the present. My plea would be not to elide the conflicts and the issue of conquest, as very often happens, nor leave its narration, or indeed the drawing up of historical lessons from the point of view of a narrowly majoritarian construction of the past. On the contrary, I shall be making a plea for newer histories of conflict, conquest, sectarian strife, as belonging to the life history of the Indian nation, not following outside it. My purpose in advocating such histories is to make the nation a better, a more fulfilling place, in a word, more habitable for its various denizens. The online Oxford English Dictionary defines denizen as, quote, a person or plant that lives or is found in a particular place, unquote. An exemplary usage of this in the online dictionary goes as follows. Quote, I would like to take you on a little journey through my backyard in Ithaca to meet some pleasant denizens I spend much of my time admiring, unquote. So permit me. The notion of belonging to a present nation state involves a replication of a sense of them and us through icons, stories, and narratives. The siring of communities, shall we say, and narratives about long-existing collectivities often take place simultaneously. And they have a duplex and a duplicitous claim to history and to particularistic remembrances of times past. There has developed in India, especially since the mid-80s, a powerful current that pulls all public discourse into, quote, that may be your history, but this is our past. Extant histories of Indian land mass, written under the discursive and institutional tutelage of the West, such a view insists even more stridently today than before, don't answer to our present national needs. Rather than simply confronting pasts, ingenious or disingenuous, with definitive historical records, historiography, I argue, or shall try to argue, must have a place for the ways pasts are remembered and retailed. Retailed being used here in both its primary and secondary senses. As one, the sale of goods in relatively small quantities to the public, and two, recount retail details of. I shall argue further that we need to unravel the relationship of such pasts to the sense of a perceived notion of belonging. As a practicing historian then, rather than say this is the fact while you remember something completely at variance to that, as a practicing historian, in fact, one must pose afresh the relationship between memory and history, the oral and the transmitted, the stereotypical and lived history. Forgive me for offering a crash course in Indian history of the past millennium to underline what has been at stake, what really has been at stake in constructing a view of India's medieval past. Ruled by Muslim kings of different dynasties, the Sultanate of Delhi, circa 200, expanded over the next 3 centuries to encompass large parts of northern and peninsular India. And when it got snuffed out in the 1520s by an adventurer from a petty principality in present-day Uzbekistan, the Delhi kingdom was replaced by the more glamorous Mughal Empire, which lasted as an expanded imperial venture till the early 18th century and nominally till the suppression of the Great Rebellion of 1857. It was then that the last of the Mughals were exiled by a triumphant British to oblivion in distant Rangoon. In the exercise of imperial hegemony and subcontinental power, the Mughals totally transformed the predatory meaning of the term Mongol-Mughal, reconfiguring in the process, in active interaction with indigenous local, quote-unquote, Hindu elites, a wide swath of the social, cultural, and intellectual world of India. So the Mughals really, or the idea of living under the Mughals does, in fact, constitute a common sense which often straddles class and even region, hence the predominance of Persian-based revenue terms in the languages of southern India as well. The longue durée of medieval Muslim conquest and rule circa 1200 onwards has understandably been the object of considerable narrative anxiety, at least, and much more so from the 19th century, late 19th century to the present. And for good reason. For at the heart is the issue of pre-colonial conquest of the subcontinent and of its consequences. How different was this medieval Muslim India of Turkish sultans and Mughal padshahs from the conquest and colonization by industrial Britain? Here, most accounts have been unable to extricate themselves from the blame-praise format, and a good deal of this has to do with the tie-up between history writing and nation formation. For a large part, historians' history usually relates to one form of community, the national community. Modern history invokes the idea of a people as sovereign and historically constituted. And this has been productive of most national histories. The triumph of the idea of self-determination has meant that all conquest has come to be regarded as unjust, naturally unjust. How can historians' history then re-engage in newer ways the issue of conquest? In our case, the Turkish conquest of India, North India largely, circa 1200, and Imperial Mughal presence and past Pax Mughalia of the 16th and 17th century. And here, I'm just repeating the arguments put forward by Partho Chatterjee about late 19th century histories written in the vernacular in Bengal, really emerging as a kind of a new, quote-unquote, nationalist history, where there is a stereotypical and factual distinction drawn between innate characteristics of conquerors and the conquered, including the descendants, shall we say, in lineage descendants of those who came from outside and conquered us. There's enough evidence, though, to suggest that the categories Hindus and Muslims have been deployed contextually for quite some time. I don't have to really, go over the large amount of work that has been done in this. Hierarchies of caste, notions of place, status, and purity, gradations of occupation, calling and work, affiliation to sects, devotion to powerfully deified dead, partaking of common speech, sharing of a literate and popular culture, all these went into the making of the real-life Indians, individuals, families, and groups with a multi-layered sense of the self. Diametrically opposed to this, of course, is the case of what in India is called communal riots or communal strife or interreligious strife, riots, where the blurring of boundaries of the everyday are deliberately violated through symbolic and actual acts of violence, where a person who's different, it is not only discovered to be different, he is seen in all senses of the term to be different. And the larger the view, the greater the alleged difference. Between these two extremities, the fluidities of boundaries in the everyday and the horrific carving of bodies of victims of riots, there is the historicist position that suggests that over a large stretch of the Gangetic Plain and in parts of central India, the forging of a link of language, community, nation in the heyday of Victorian colonialism led to a hardening of religious-based identities among the city population in North India, where language, culture, and nation were brought together in the haiku that was coined in late 19th century, Uttar Pradesh, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, language, community, and nation. Given that this conquest was historic, and this emerges in both literary and historical works. In fact, it's interesting that even when, in my generation, most of the medieval Indian history that you read was in primers of Hindi language, because that was supposed to evoke a common remembered past, which was put across. And so poems and, tropes and particular episodes as picked up, what really taught to us as specimen of best Hindi literature properly meant for school children. So it's literature with a connection to history that is supposed to imbue you with a sense of nationalism. Earlier, the better. The most powerful and very nearly the first such response to opposing this kind of construction came from Professor Muhammad Habib of Aligarh Muslim University, who wrote a series of pioneering articles between the 1920s and 1950s, and in which he put forward some very, very bold propositions. I'm not going to go into the details of those, just to indicate what Habib was trying to rewrite. For instance, he wrote that the Muslims of India were not so much the progeny of Turkic conquerors, but as local converts from the artisanal classes, socially and spatially at the margins of both Hindu society and early medieval towns. More importantly for Habib, quote, such limited success as India achieved in India, he was referring obviously to the fact that the percentage of Muslim population really is much larger, the largest on the two wings of the empire, the western and the eastern, rather than the center of the empire. That such limited success as Islam achieved in India as a proselytizing force was not due to its kings and politicians, but to its saints. So there is this implicit in that is a kind of a opposition between the so-called sword of Islam and the kind of saintly element of Islam, which any meaningful writing of medieval Indian history has, as it were, built into its very optics. Without that, you can't even begin writing. And it's, in fact, in my new work, in other things I've written, I'm trying to really get to grapple with this initial move, rather than critiquing the details of it or the regional angularities and particularities of that. And this, of course, how to write medieval India in the face of majoritarian revisionism, shall we say, that's a very, very academic word, revisionism. Well, we know that from the Soviet Union that it has very strong political life and death consequences. So one contemporary response when faced with the resurgence of religious imaginings of historical past is for some intellectuals to re-emphasize India's wanted syncretism, plucking, shall we say, at the strains of demotic poetry of a 14th century weaver saint like Kabir, or the structured ragas of a classical vocalist whose musical renditions continue to soar well above foundational divides. So you find examples and stress the crossing over that has been central. And in fact, such a view was most eloquently put forward by none other than Amartya Sen in a pained and impassioned piece published in the New York Review of Books in April 1993. Date is significant, just a few months after the destruction of a medieval mosque in Ayodhya. So that's been, when faced with this kind of resurgence and its impact not only on the polity but on actual individuals, one way to respond to that is to, once again lay out our commonalities. Looking at the underpinnings of these remarks, it is clear that even for somebody like Amartya Sen, one is echoing some of the tropes that have gone into the political constitution of Indian secularism. And this at a moment of the reconfiguration of the two major religious communities through politics in 47-49. The major fact remains that despite a large exodus and killings, there remained a very substantial Muslim minority within the newly constituted Indian nation state. So political secularism, in the Indian case, as somebody like Rajiv Bhargava has emphasized, did not involve, as in the West, incorporating or engaging with the religious minority, shall we say, after the fact. It was constitutive of the making of the Indian nation state, with minority rights in the sphere of religious, educational, and familial matters being placed on the same footing as the right to life and universal adult franchise. They are defined as fundamental rights. But complications remained. Not only was there a sizable Muslim minority in India, which could be impacted upon and in turn influence the arithmetic of electoral politics and hence of democracy. A sizable chunk of Indian society was characterized in turn by entanglements, imbrications, a specifically South Asian métissage of Indo-Islamic presence with a Hindu-Indic core. This history had its textbook versions, and it operated with clear-cut categories with built-in contrast between soldiers and jihadi warrior deploying the sword of Islam. On the one hand, and what shall we say, the rosary-fondling Sufis, pacifists, saintly proselytizers who ministered to the needs of a multi-religious populace at large. Things on the ground were, of course, muddled. I prefer the term cluttered, which is imagery of a room full of furniture resistant to easy ordering. When roles and allegiances were cluttered, cultural interaction, if seen solely through the prism of syncretism, could only feature as an anodyne management of differences in the past. Anodyne management of differences in the past, without really, confronting the past or engaging with the past, or as another phrase I shall use is raking the past anew. But this is how textbook history, of course, of the, either of the syncretic or the innately conflictual sort, argued, with using metaphors like, very little mixing of a slick of oil in a pail of water and so on. Syncretism in the genealogy of our best well-meaning medievalist was the obverse of the shield of conquest and conflict. Not a set of myriad dispositions, grounded local worldviews, and boundary crossings after the fact, whose persistence towards time, across time was better suited to a structure, and we were able to, and I'm arguing that one can engage with this through a structured engagement with the popular mind rather than the certitudes of chronicle history or its hubris. It is precisely such concerns that have animated, again I'm calling Partha Chatterjee out of sheer loyalty to him, making a plea for what he calls an analytic of the popular. Because of the positivist basis of history writing, popular was a word that historians were uncertain how to engage with, leaving it to anthropologists or other people. Partha had a very, very interesting set of observations about the 1980s from which, and the developments in the 1980s from which this particular project that I've just tried to finish arose. Writes Partha Chatterjee, in spite of attempts within the university to defend the autonomy of the discipline on the old basis, while outside in the domain of politics, the campaign of the Hindu right waxed and waned through the decades of the 1980s. One important stream of awareness seemed to emerge among a new generation of historians. What perhaps required was a redefinition of the discipline, not as before, by excluding popular practices of memory from its list of approved practices, but rather by incorporating within itself an appropriate analytic of the popular. And this, a lot of us who had begun working on this hoary problem of conquest and imaginings and conflict, we were also being pushed or trying to engage with, trying to emerge out of the self-constructed cage of scientific history that had made the historian so fearful of the popular, virtually immobilizing his or her in its presence. So that, you actually, so that it's no surprise that the great efflorescence of medieval Indian history, especially the Mughals, in Aligarh, for instance, was heavily concentrated on the state and society and economy, rather than society and what was medieval or what was Mughal-like in terms of its impact on everyday life. So the state and economy were the tropes through which the Mughal state, or an interesting slip of tongue, was conceptualized. Now, let me make my plea more explicit. What I'm saying, what I'm arguing for, as I repeated, is for us in India as historians, not as pamphleteers, to rake the past anew. I wish to argue further that faced with the majoritarian challenge in the present and the plea both historical and commonsensical for a new national history, what we need is not simply an emphasis on India's composite culture. Of course, we need that. But we also need something beyond the reiteration of sturdy certitudes. We need non-sectarian histories of sectarian conflict, of conquest of the past. Otherwise, the professional engagement with past is actually, of a medieval past, is actually, leaving major issues out of the purvey of the historiographically possible in terms of actual writing, and leaving it to other imaginings and other constructions, which then one tries to come with and counter with solid facts. So the move itself is defeated. Rather than engaging with that, you just leave it aside, and when somebody throws a missile at you, you say, no, well, that is because of this reason or that reason, or Ain Akbari doesn't talk about it, So, well, actually it does a lot of things. So just to digress a little bit, so I've always found it very, very peculiar that we, in working on 19th and 20th century India, read Natalie Davis, Carl Ginsberg, et cetera, those who talk about medieval sensibilities, while these guys are completely absent from the footnotes of our best medieval historians till very, very recently. So let me just dig into the meat of the paper, and I've got 15 minutes or so. And it's the interesting thing as I began working on this project is whatever I thought was well worked out argument was seen as provocation, which kind of suggests how we were so satisfied with the existing framework that anything that seemed like unsettling it meant that you had already crossed the boundary to the other side, or which I found as a historian completely unacceptable, because one was trying to raise new questions rather than have a dividing line and step on this. It's not like the famous sturdy game of kabaddi in India. So what I want to do is just indicate some of the ways in which one can, begin to essay histories of conflict. Let's look at our great Sufi masters and the hagiographies about the power of these masters, Muinuddin Chishti, Nizamuddin Auliya, and so on. These Sufis, the sheikhs, who are called saints, these Sufis, though gentle in their persona, especially in archetypal opposition to the holy warriors, had to carve out forcefully their spiritual domain against the already existing authority of Hindu yogis. You just don't come and say, I'm a Sufi, as we have, every Hindi film must have a Sufi song now. So I'm a Sufi and, come and kneel, shall we say. There is already a guy sitting by a nice place, normally by the river, with a whole entourage of acolytes and, and chelas and so on, who has already acquired a reputation for being a miraculous person with power and so on. And the Sufi can't just, bypass him, bypass the town and go to the countryside. In order to establish, you have to engage with that. And when you look at the hagiographical literature of the major Sufis, a spiritual contest, which often also means actually defeating in some kind of a miraculous combat physically, the yogi, is the very basis of the constitution of the power and establishment of the cult of a newly, shall we say, arriviste Sufi in a region, right? So that if the notion of conflict is central to the hagiography of our most famous Sufis, then why is it that we have just left it as malfuzat, table talk, right? Rather than engage with what is so central, and which focus then actually conceptually begins to unsettle the contest force of a different sort, and the pacifist message of Islam. So that is an entry that should have been really picked up many years ago, but because the great scholar in this field has, of course, been none other than, shall we say, the Cambridge-trained Sufi, Simon Digby, who wrote really absolutely fabulous accounts of spiritual encounters between yogis and Sufis and so on. Not only that, sometimes in these accounts what you get are toponymic indicators of the success of the Sufi. And that's the most important thing. So sometimes all that remains of the prepossessing yogi is a wisp of a name, carrying the toponymic stigmata, so to speak, of a historic defeat for all to utter. Many place names in the Gangetic heartland enshrine such memories of holy victories and defeats. Though I'm far from arguing that every time a local mentions, say, the name of Mau Nath Bhanjan, he or she necessarily recollects the destruction Bhanjan of the Lord and Master Nath of Mau. Mau Nath Bhanjan is a very thriving weaving town in eastern UP. And the name itself is the Bhanjan destruction of the Nath of Mau. In other cases, the spiritual master is transformed into an ogre by the sheer act of transcription from one language to the other. So the word Dev, which has such major political and spiritual connotation, is written up as Dev, which is an ogre in Farsi. So that nothing else is happening. The name remains the same. Spiritually and linguistically mastered, the holy harmful figure often submits before the majestic Sufi, who grants him the last wish of his subservience, being recorded for posterity in terms of a trace, either in place name or as a suitable marker of a monstrous sort, so that at the shrine of Ghazimi and Bahraich in northern eastern UP, the earrings of the subdued Dev or Danav, Nirmal, are the size of grindstones, right? So that, the very fact that, this represents that subdued Dev physically, actually, makes the power of the Sufi greater, and also relegates simultaneously an otherwise, quote-unquote, human figure into just, a chakki or a grindstone. These are the ways in which eventful encounters between the holy men of Islam and the Hindus get enshrined in the life histories of popular Sufi sites. And of course, these shrines attract both Hindus and Muslims as devotees. Let me clarify. My point is not to deny the following of India's justly famous Sufi saints. All I wish to do is to create a space for encounter, clash, and conquest as necessary elements of the conflictual prehistory of such cultic sites as Muinuddin Chishti's of Ajmer or Nizamuddin Aulia of Delhi. So that wrathful, hypostatical miraculous events and encounters, I'm suggesting not a simple, long-standing Indian spirit of accommodation going to the making of accounts of India's wanted syncretism. Or to put it sharply, accommodation is predicated necessarily in such stories on a prior conflict of two opposing wills. The hermetically cloistered figures of the rosary-fondling Sufis and the saber-rattling Ghazi, even when yoked to the cause of good pluralistic politics, produces, I'm arguing, bad history. Not history with the capital H, but the representation and recollection of their exploits outside a proper, verifiable, contemporary medieval archive. So, what I'm arguing is that for us to understand shall we say, even the historical beginnings of syncretism, we have to read the archive in such a way that the popular reception of these stories is somehow accommodated in our account, rather than take these apart as miraculous events and then sing, the praise of India's great Sufis who operated in very, very different ways. Now, I want to try and wrap up this argument by making one or two historical points. When we look at accounts of war or of conquest, even when written by a great syncretic person, you can't have a greater syncretic person in medieval India than Amir Khusro, who famously described himself as a Hindustani Turk. When you read his account of Alauddin Khilji, the Delhi Sultan of the late 13th century's conquest of the Deccan, Khusro is a great poet. He writes an account in Farsi, in Persian, in prose, and actually tries to marvel and impress the reader with linguistic conceits, double entendres, puns, and so on and so forth. So that on the one hand, you have got a person who really is the progenitor of the common vernacular of northern India. On the other hand, his account is really written not only for the king, but it has to be a virtuoso performance of language in order to gain favor with the king and also develop the potentialities of Persian prose. So what do we do with this? Obviously, this is a far cry. Mughal or medieval conquest was, in fact, a lot of blood and gore. But the language, of course, could not be of smart bombs and collateral damage, of anodyne phrases, but excess of meaning being generated. Now, so that we don't really have access to a photocopy reality of what war was like, because a description of war and conquest is already tuned to a particular mode of presenting, especially the victory. So are we going to just say that Khusro didn't write this, that he only broke a dholak and made it into tabla and was the progenitor of the great sitar? And when confronted with this, we are saying, well, yes, but this is not. I'm not making a great claim of having rewritten. I'm not a medievalist at all. I'm saying that there must be a space for entering into the common sense and descriptive strategies of interaction and conquest of those time, linguistically and aesthetically, and not only in terms of certitudes of the written Farsi word. Because if you do that, then you are not really engaging with what has been inadequately conceptualized as medieval India's medieval imagination. And that would be a real pity if we just turn our heads and see how much work and how much insight into the actual practice of writing new kind of history has really emerged in France and Italy with engagement with the medieval popular. Let me just end, and perhaps I can take up some of the things I've written in the QA, and let me just, especially in view of the poster now, refer to the nest and end with that. The final lesson in the Hindi language primers for a good 40 years in North India has been an aggressively nationalist poem in Sanskritic Hindi, which has to be memorized by students 10 to 12 years old. The one for standard 6, that is for children about 10, 12, 11 years old, is, I'll just say that in Hindi and then translate it. Chahta hoon desh ki dharti tujhe kuch aur bhi doon. I wish my nation I could give you something more than my mind, my body, my life, my money, etc., etc. I mean, I was talking about the excess of meaning of description of medieval conquest. Here it is always, n+1, shall we say, involved in building the imagination of what a child must do for the nation. A stanza that sticks in my mind as I recall my childhood in terms of an explanation that I was offering to my 12-year-old goes as follows. I surrender my body, each and every twig and straw of my nest. I surrender to you, the country of my birth. And yet, I feel that I must yield something more besides that, because you are the land of my birth. Hindi, man samarpit, I give my mind. Tan samarpit, I give my body. Need ka trin samarpit, each and every twig from my nest I take out. Because in order to make the nation more habitable, shall we say. I disagreed when I tried to bring home the meaning of the word trin by saying that this is the trin in Trinamool Congress, which is the grassroots politics, very Sanskritic word. I'm not saying that when I was in 1959, I figured this out, of course. You needed subordinate studies and other such nice things to make sense of that. So I disagree more amidst the continuous cussedness about nationalism that we now find in India today, which leaves little room to distinguish between the left and the right view of it, where culture, politics, and majoritarian view of our common past make any critical, historical, or minority perspective fall foul of the nation and perhaps of the law as well. Arguments about Indian culture pivot around hyphenated religion and nation. Today in India, as in many other parts of the world, writes Gyan Pandey, the religious is the national. At least that is the commonly propagated and, sadly, broadly accepted view today. Hence, the need to struggle disciplinarily against this, and also to take the rhetorical statement of our politicians from the ramparts of whichever fort they address about history will say this or historians will write. Coming back to the metaphor of the nest cannibalized, shall we say, nationally, it is my firm view that the nation can never be made habitably by ruining the many dwellings where the peoples of India have nestled historically with or without conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Amin, for a scintillating lecture. We've got plenty of time for questions and comments. I wonder if I may start with just a brief question. You pose powerfully this question of how to write the medieval at a time of majoritarian revisionism and suggest we need to go beyond a simple restatement of platitudes about syncretism or a composite culture, thinking really anew about how to write histories of conflict. And I wondered if I may ask, without wishing for too pessimistic an answer, where the spaces are, perhaps beyond the academy, where such a discussion, such an initiative may be found.
let me, obviously it's very difficult. I'm saying that, and I don't want to, pat myself on the back. I'm saying that when 20 years ago I was raising these issues among fellow historians, they said, why should you do this? Let those guys, write. Why should any professional historian, muddy his hand with conquest? We are so. So what I'm saying is that even when it turned 25 years ago, we were so taken in by talking about the medieval in particular ways that anything that was different was, as I mentioned, was seen as controversial, which is a very peculiar, statist term, in so. But on the other hand, and obviously the space is shrinking, but I think there is a need for actually works of a newer sort being written which are in disciplinary term, novel and innovative, and which go outside and rummage through the archives and the works of others who have, in say Europe, who have worked on this. So that's one. Whether or not it's accepted is another issue. But why is it that we don't really, because as it were, quote unquote, the greater the danger, the more you kind of, get into the behind the city walls. So that's one. But on the other hand, there is a space, and I can't really say how really to, breach this. That you look at Hindi films. Now it's almost obligatory to have a Sufi song. And or to look at the revival of very classical arcane arts of narration, dastan, for instance, in Delhi and other parts of India, something that the development of modern Urdu prose had laid aside as not belonging to its culture, and the two are in fact very interestingly, intricately connected, that we are trying, if you look at it this way, that relating to something which is different without completely understanding it or grasping it or mastering it is still a possibility. You can't just say, why are you saying this? I don't understand this. Or why are you saying this? I already know this. Then in which case there can't be any discussion. So in a way, I think it also depends on the manner in which you put across views that are contrary, views that are beyond the normal, and create a space where recognition and appreciation of something that you don't fully recognize and don't fully empathize with still belongs to the life history of the nation. And you can look at it the other way around, sorry if I may, that the Nehruvian idea of a commonality of being Indian and having been descended from a common struggle obviously has given way to the fact that identities are here to stay. Look at the debate that is taking place on not only on regionalism but on Dalit issues. So you can't say that you're a feminist and therefore you might be against the national project, or a particular kind of feminism, a particular kind of views of the role of in women in Indian freedom struggle is what should profit. So that if difference now 40 years later is being recognized within the present, surely there must be some efforts to create difference of the past as belonging to the life history of the nation. So that's what I'm, but obviously, the climate of history, and I'm here using the word climate of history in a different sense from my friend Dipesh Chakravarti, is very, very dim and very, very bad in India. Yeah.
Thank you. The floor is open. If you'd please come to the microphones, and for the live streaming, just introduce yourself first. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Amin. My name is Homa Gupta. I'm a third-year PhD student at MIT in a program called History, Theory, and Criticism. So perhaps some of my confusion arises from being in such an interdisciplinary space. I was particularly struck by your take on this notion, the trope of syncretism, and how it has been appropriated at different moments, such as in '93, as you mentioned, to kind of provide a counterfactual and say, oh, you know what? Once we lived together so well, so today we can also live together. And while, as a historian, it is problematic the way those moments are appropriated, or medieval Indian history is appropriated, it has a political, kind of catalytic political energy, let's say. On the other hand, you also you're talking so much about history, you're talking about Ginsberg's work. And Ginsberg's project, I mean, one of the things he mentions in his introduction is trying to restore the notion of the individual to a particular class, and not thinking about that class as having a mentality, but rather an individuality, a perspective.
Against the French kind of.
Exactly. However, the problem for a PhD student like myself who's trying to write is always a question of vocabulary. So, you know, we can kind of speak against a certain hyphenated form of identity. We can speak against a certain form of cultural production that is Indo-Islamic or syncretic. But in this, I think there seems to be a struggle with how do we actually speak of it without essentializing. Because the minute we talk about conflict and we identify the actors in the conflict with particular labels, there is a notion that we are accepting, at least in the moment, that they have this idea. Or there's a continuity between that identity in that medieval past and today's presentist notion of that identity. And you have someone like an art historian like Barry Flood, who uses the term always already transcultural as a way to kind of move away from the hyphenated, move away from the binary. Anyways, this is me just trying to engage with your talk and ask you a very open-ended question of, you know, if historians, students like ourselves, take on this invocation you're putting forward, what strategy for language have you thought of, or are you currently using to deal with this complexity? So.
Let me respond to a very interesting set of issues that you have raised. And by making a disclaimer, that whatever I have tried to present as general things actually arises from very, very particular engagement with the problem, and that is the way that I try and work. So it's not that in 1980s I said, hey, this is happening, and why don't you do this, and I'll do, This is because I was hit, in the face by this character whom I've studiously kept out of this, because the book will come out in September, with this guy called Salar Masood, Ghazi Mian, who is such an incredible character, still a living presence, that card-carrying historians of medieval India haven't even bothered to write an article on it. I mean, in a way that it goes back to the way I picked up a negative event with Chauri Chaura and said, I'm trying to understand nationalism with this. So I'm trying to understand this guy, who, interestingly, the popular name is Ghazi Mian, which is not a proper name. Ghazi and Mian is the common word for Muslim. Who's he? He's supposed to be the nephew of none other than the notorious Mahmud of Ghazni. Well, while chronicles tell us that Mahmud of Ghazni had sisters but no such nephew. So, and he dies fighting, in northeastern India in 1034, trying to save cows, and he dies unwed. He dies on the day of his wedding. He's the archetypal brother who comes to meet his sister, who is in the mother-in-law's house undergoing drudgery. So why is it that, first of all, how can you have somebody who didn't exist in Mahmud of Ghazni, 11th century, placed in that time, and yet survive the experiences, the common tropes, imaginings of those times. Why not? Why wasn't it? Perhaps they should have taken him out from the time of, the polluting time of Mahmud Ghazni and spun him round as the greatest thaumaturgic saint. But that's not what is done. He is a warrior and he is a saint, but he actually displaces the more, important Mahmud Ghazni, right? So, meaning, and historians didn't deal with it because he didn't exist in the time he was supposed to exist in it, right? 11th century. There was no account of his life, though Ibn Battuta visits the shrine in 1341 and finds it too crowded, so he can't enter it, and he's being accompanied by the Sultan of Delhi. So the problem that suggested to me was to try and use this figure and not reduce him to a thaumaturgic or an ethnographic description of the shrine, to anthropologize him, but to try and struggle and try to put forward the idea that at some time, in some moments, the fact that he gets located in the time of Mahmud of Ghazni means that the multi-religious following is nodding in a particular way towards the time of conflict. So that his popularity does not necessarily entail his being taken away from the time of the conflict. And yet the cult survives till today, right? So what I'm trying to say, so that there is a language in which, when you talk about women, in fact, I argue in the book that, what you get is the domestication of conflict by locating his power in the most feminine and most womanly concerns about childbirth, about barrenness, about mother-in-laws and so on, or marriage and so on, right? So that what I'm saying is that historically, if you look at that there is the popularity of the cult cannot be taken away. In the popularity of the cult, the miraculous is not able to push the constructed historical, which is perhaps not his time, because he was perhaps in the 13th century a composite figure. But the allusion to the time of Mahmud of Ghazni means that in the popular veneration of this most syncretic saint, simultaneously the language, or there's a gesture to a past. See what I'm trying to say is that so that, you are not emptying the popular mind of conflict. Obviously, people are not made to kneel and recite the conquest of Mahmud of Ghazni almost as if they have to recite the Islamic credo, right? If you come to the shrine, let me tell you that, this guy, Mahmud of Ghazni, this guy is there, and yet we are making it. And that is how the colonial officials and a lot of the anti-Ghazimiyya tract says that people have just forgotten. I'm just trying to argue that people also remember conflicts differently. And that then raises the issue of language. How do we enter this world which otherwise is designated as supernatural or rustic belief and so on and so forth, and yet constantly give a historical depth to the imaginings of the past, where actual events are actually, somewhere or the other in the backdrop. I don't know whether I'm making myself clear, but what I'm saying is that all this waffle that, you have sat through in the past 40 minutes actually arises from dealing over a decade, going to the shrine, reading the Farsi text, with engaging with this phenomena. And then, just as I try to argue, saying that Chauri Chaura is a recalcitrant event, the moment you narrate it, the way in which the mainstream is narrated is called into question. I'm saying that as far as Sufism and conquest is concerned, this guy is a recalcitrant presence. And that is why you have authenticated, 100% Shuddh Desi Ghee sort of, Sufi saints on the one hand, and the warriors that we have, or as in the work of people who are full-time medievalists. Mind you, I'm not a medievalist, which is an account of how Sufis are camp followers of armies that march into the Deccan, Nagore and others that you have described. So, I'm just, I've retired, but I'm still struggling. Sure.
My name is Mo Banerjee. I'm a PhD student at the History Department here at Harvard. Thank you so much, Professor Amin, for what has been an absolutely amazing lecture. I'm very, very glad that you have come here and shared with us your ideas about talking about conquest. The one word which I don't think you used even once in a brilliant 50-minute lecture was communalism. And one of the ways in which to talk about conquest historiographically in India, especially between the majority and the minority, has been communalism. And reading back a history of communalism, or a prehistory of communalism, as C.A. Bailey would have called it, into the medieval past, which is what the destruction of Babri Masjid is about, reading back a communal conflict back into medieval India. In your idea of reconfiguring the idea of conquest as something that is familiar, something that is dealt with in everyday piety, how do you see that this already very present majoritarian historian view of communalism, that can be dismantled to find a habitable space for the minorities in our country, and also ethically for historians to deal
space for
communalism, for writing a history which gives minority histories their space without bringing in the specter of communalism, if I may put it that way. But also, how is historians to be ethically engaged with the term of conquest as also something that is creative rather than destructive? Thank you.
You see, the other I've indicated that, but in fact, I started thinking about it in terms of what was happening to India in the 1980s, where one of the tropes was that people have forgotten, those who should have remembered. The inheritors of events of 1,000 years have to be disabused of their blindness to the past, right? And that if you give a particular kind of politics, that memory which is somewhere there would get activated. And the first idea that came to and in the book, towards the end, I say a couple of things about it. And one idea that I thought I'll try and work with, that it's not that so-called the people, there is the idea that we are, the kind of a blood group idea of memory. That it's, and there is obviously the metaphor of the blood and so on. I was trying to struggle with that. It's not that people have forgotten, but that they remember differently, and we haven't really bothered to really engage with this. That we have consigned that remembrance out by latching on to what is otherwise available disciplinarily, and in terms of the distance between us and them. Peasants are like that. Women, what more do you expect? But these are central tropes in the making of the of the cult of Ghazi. That in fact he is born to a woman who's otherwise derided as the typical Banj or infidel woman. Straight connection with most common anxiety after marriage, which is again the lot of what domesticity is about. That unless you have a male child within 1 year, you're either thrown out or you better go to the right shrine, which happens to be, paradoxically, a shrine of some saint who is not 100% Indic. And that really then creates, in the creation of and many people have worked on it, Charu Gupta and Shumar Malhotra and so on, that the creation of the community in the late 19th century is based on the policing of the boundaries of women across caste and across religion. So, the idea was to try and probe the workings of this memory rather than its lapse. And saying, how must we do it? The other kind of entry was to actually document, and which I do, there's a section called Counter Histories, that, that from the 1870s, there has been a concerted effort to say, why are you people going there? Don't you know? So a kind of popular history lesson is being put forward by male publicists who talk about women and our identity and community. And yet the cult survives. Perhaps, it's not, there are still about 100 to 150,000 people that go, so that the book then also analyzes, in terms of your argument, what then are the counter histories, and to what extent they must necessarily engage and accentuate the text, which is anyway hagiographical. So that the writing of the Arya Samaj pamphleteers is actually creates what I have called counterfactual stereotypical. If this guy died saving cows, of course we know. These guys eat cows; they don't save cows. So the cows must have been there, for his shadi, because so that there is no getting away from the textual narrative, which is a part of the cult. But you are saying now you read it differently because we are talking about them, about whom we know. Don't you know this guy, right? So there is, and a lot of these are in terms of the intelligent Hindu housewife who is engaging with low-caste women and saying, telling them what history is about. So that, in a way, again, I'm going back to what I've tried to do, is by engaging fully with the counter narratives and their implication as they must be with the hagiographical, you are able to kind of document a history of this conflict and contest. And then still you are left with is it an irreducible essence that remains? Or is it that people can juggle with a past which does not fully define them, but which they don't have to completely discard or forget totally in order to relate to present-day anxieties and concerns. So that there is a notion of the everyday, which is not a completely kind of a-historicized everyday. And that is what I find fascinating, that bits of history or a particular construction of the past is there. I'm not saying, I'm not saying this is our hope for India and so on. We can't live by GDP alone, etc., etc. I'm just saying that, to be honest to the craft of history, is that actually I am doing my own little thing. But I must clear the ground to be able to do my little things. And if from there I can then pull up some threads by which I can then, make certain broad suggestions, that's how I work. See what I mean? That, so it's not a kind of prior theoretical engagement and what are the possibilities for doing this kind of history. You try to create, pick up a theme which you have not really, kind of fabricated in the workshop of history, which is hitting you in the head from, Akbar, tries to understand who these pilgrims were, and they recognize him, and then he rushes off and tells Abul Fazl in 1600, these guys are, these are the devotees, and he actually endows the shrine. So why is it that we have not, as historians, we have forsaken, what a time, why have we forsaken Ghazi Mia totally as a historian? Because then we are really bound by the criteria of scientific history, which is a peculiar criteria to have if you're talking about medieval India.
Hi, thank you for this talk. My name is Atiya Khurakiwala. I'm a student I'm a PhD student in the Department of Architecture, Landscape and Urbanism here at Harvard. I was really interested in what you were suggesting about the excesses in these kind of hagiographic accounts, in this kind of thaumatological stories that we tell. And I feel like you were suggesting that methodologically we can look to those excesses in language and in poetry and aesthetic excesses, aesthetic surpluses, as a way to get to the past. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little more specific. I know you've talked about that, you've referred to that, but I was wondering if you could speak to that specifically in terms of how we can kind of understand these. Because, I mean, there are excesses. So I, work in this kind of post-war, post-independence moment, but I find that there are excesses, these kind of aesthetic excesses in the most quantitative stories that you might see. And I'm wondering in that sense that what are these kind of excesses that can give you an account of history where you might not expect them to be?
I mean, let's just that's I can see where the question that you posed arises from, but again let's start with little things, meaning I looked at the postal directory of all the districts of UP, because you have to identify even small hamlets to which the letters have to go. So that is the encyclopedia of place names, right? And the intriguing thing is that, in fact, when I was growing up, there used to be a poster at most railway stations saying, "Be careful when you write Rampur, which Rampur do you mean?" You have to give the tehsil and the thana and the post office and so on. And towards the end of the book, I slightly playfully saying that the same could be said for Ghazipur or Salar Tola. There's Ghaziabad, there's Ghazipur. So that especially, and it's not, and so it's not changing names by fiat. One is that Akbar conquers a place, or after the king, the name, it's called Akbarabad, or Aurangzeb tried fancy name for Gorakhpur, it didn't work. Moazzamabad, who knows what Moazzamabad was? So Gorakhnath got the better of Aurangzeb, right? In the long run, but where there are ethnographic accounts, largely in gazetteers compiled by the British in the late 19th century, but because they are identifying place names and so on, and they are tied not only to the fiat of a king, but to a history. That really, so that there are numerous place names that are associated with either Ghazi or Salar is a commander throughout the Gangetic plain. Secondly, it is not simply the kind of a constructed genealogy of the prominent landed families in Awadh and so on. So, we were actually the camp followers of the first, of Ghazimia, right? But there are legends and stories which are about, the army went through here he crossed the river, here this happened, and there's this place, and there's this name, right? So that the place names are not really given, they arise. And the people in the localities, at the moment they talk about a place, they are relating, I'm saying that obviously they're not relating in this kind of a certified historical sense, but they're saying any medieval grave in Awadh is invariably associated with the campaign of Salar Masood. And there's an interesting fact over here. Ramnath Harper made this point many, many years ago, that what is so interesting for place names emanating from Ramayana and Ramcharitmanas is the notion of exile. If you are exiled, then you are moving. Then you stopped over here. The keyword said this to you. Then this kind of thing. So the preponderance of Rampurs is not centrally from the fact that in Ayodhya Tulsidas wrote this text, which so many people in so many villages read and said, why don't we call our village also Rampur? The notion of exile then creates a space. Similarly, the fact that it is not a definitive battle but a set of campaigns that Salar Masood's army rages means that all sorts, any medieval, the Awadh of those times, shall we say, is of olden times, is not simply of Ram, it's also of Ghazimia. And that's why you still get, Rampurs and Ghazipurs, actually not exactly coexist, but, the locals would be able to give you, as good a history about why this grave is so big, because the horse was also buried along with the guy, right? So that, so let me say that these are what I'm saying today over here are probings. Let's probe this, and in terms of what else we have accumulated about popular culture, about history, we would be able then to rework something which would only be purely descriptive, and try and give it depth. How far that depth is, how genuine it is, how 100% history is it, that's not my, you can't really do 100% history with peasant belief and peasant, So what I'm saying is that if you want to understand, so-called syncretism and multi-religious following of especially Indo-Turkic saints, then, you have to rejig somewhere or the other, the E.H. Carr and what is history, and, that's not going to, really help you. And in a way, let me just end by saying that in some ways, often the so-called positivist kind of a re-narration of quote-unquote Hindu history is actually based on hagiographies. What would be a positivist Hindu counter history of Ghazi which relies on a hagiography, which is written in the court of Jahangir in 17th century, which refers to a non-existent text. So I'm sorry, I'm not able to really, answer questions, because what I'm trying to suggest, based on my own work, is that we really have to be not afraid, as and I'm speaking as a historian, of engaging with the intractable, rather than be very happy with finding more and more of the definitive.
Well, on that inspiring note, please join me in thanking Professor Amin.
Thank
Very
you.
warm.
Thank you.